which will be Sartre. Sartre.
Oh, the next lecture is Sartre?
Because this was all in the existentialism class. So here's my idea, and I guess I was waiting till the end, but I might as well just do it right now. My idea is we not just continue up, because what we did in the existentialism class was we started with Nietzsche, and we did 10 weeks of Nietzsche. But of course, you all missed that because I was doing that a private session with another guy who comes here occasionally. And when we finished the Nietzsche section, the Heidegger section was next, and I decided to open it up for everybody else, and that's why you all are here. And so my idea is, rather than go forward with Sartre, we shall next week go back and start with Nietzsche. And the reason for doing that is because I did listen to the next Sartre lecture, and yeah, this is a better idea, that we go back and do the whole Nietzsche segment, and that would be, I think, 10 lectures for that. Because the Sartre really will build a lot on both Nietzsche and Heidegger. So if we lay those foundations, then you'll get the way Matt was presenting the material, the way he intended to. So that's my plan. Next week we'll start on Heidegger.
What can you?
Next week you start on Nietzsche or Heidegger?
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Okay.
We finished Heidegger. Today's.
Which book of Nietzsche?
Well, next week it'll be in the description. We're going to, I believe, the 10 lectures mostly cover. Well, we start with the Madman, and a few things here and there from like the notebooks, and I think mostly Will to Power. But it's Matt, so it's going to be good. I've been through the whole series, and it is a good one. So you'll all love it, and it'll be in the description. And if you don't have it, I will give you the PDFs as usual.
So David, you will do the Nietzsche on
starting tomorrow. Next week, starting next week.
Next week, Monday night. Monday night,
unless anybody objects to another night. But I think Mondays are good. Seems to be good for everybody. So my other idea is, I think, and I'll just propose it to everybody, how about 2 lectures per week? Or is 1 okay? If we did double it up, was everybody, I see good smiling from some people. Yes, no? I think it would accelerate the class a bit. I think 2 is not too bad. I mean, depending on time restriction. 1 hour a week this was, and so it'll be 2 hours a week.
4 hours of lecture.
Yeah, 2 hours of the lecturing, and then the supplementary reading, of course, because I think we'll get through it a lot quicker. Will from the East Coast wants to move him earlier. I think some people are coming here from another meetup group, though, from the I think Wittgenstein. Isn't there a time on Wittgenstein?
Yeah, Audrey was in.
Audrey's, yeah, from what time is that? That's 6:30. No, it's
3 to 5. 3 to 5. They changed it. It used to be
3 to 5 Mondays. 3 to 5 Mondays. Twice a week. It's twice a week, right?
No, it's once a week.
Well, if that's the case, yeah, okay. So this is 7 p.m. Pacific time, which is 10 p.m. Eastern time.
Be harder for Australia.
Yeah.
If you move it earlier,
but
easy for the East Coast.
90 minutes ahead. I don't know if that overlaps with any other meetups that other people were attending, but if it were 90 minutes ahead, so that's 5:30 p.m. Pacific, and that would be, I believe, 6. No, it's 5. No, wait. 8:30 p.m. Eastern. That's a suggestion from Will. Is everybody okay with that? I guess I wouldn't mind, but if it's going to overlap.
Well, I prefer.
That's too
prefer-
much for me. I need a break in between Wittgenstein and
Yeah,
I have to eat dinner and
yeah,
You
Yeah,
said
me-
it doesn't work for you?
not 5:30.
yeah. Me too. I'm also kind of. I need that break.
I mean, I'm not going to go from one group right to another.
That's
and
what I was thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
It's also likely to scramble your brain.
Yeah.
Well, it's sitting in front of Zoom for that many hours. It's just
Yeah.
nothing's worth that.
Yeah. I kind of figured that. All right. I think this time is best for everybody. Seems to be. Okay. So the idea is so starting next week we'll do 2 Calarco lectures per week, which I don't think that's too bad. And it'll accelerate the time we'll spend. Because I still think this is a great class and we want to do all of it. And you'll be able to learn Nietzsche the Matt Calarco way. Just fine by me. Okay, anyway, so that's taken care of. So here we are, the last night of Heidegger. And as I said, I think, I know I learned more about Heidegger than I heard this before, but I don't think I heard this since the day I recorded them. I don't think I heard this segment before. And I really do think I know a lot more about Heidegger than I did at the beginning. And as I was saying last week, the interesting thing for me was how it all came together at the end. All of these things, why are we learning 7, 8, 9, 10 different things? They all kind of do weave together at the end, Why did we have to spend 9 weeks? Well, this is why. It wouldn't have made any sense without the preliminary understanding of exactly what all of these concepts mean. Okay, being in time. Okay, that's the name of the book. So what does he mean by time? It means to be, as Matt says, to be present. Okay, what does that mean? It means something that is, as he puts it, the terminology that he uses, something thingifiable, something commodifiable, something that instrumentalizable, something that you can use and consider as a tool. That's what being present means. Being present at hand. That is intricately connected to our conception, and when I say our, I mean our Western cultural, civilizational conception of what it means to be. That wouldn't have made sense without going through the whole thing. But now it really does make sense. The only thing that counts, the only thing that has value, the only thing that matters and is of any quality, according to our Western civilizational concept, is something that can be utilized, something that can be used, something that we can profit from, something that we can gain from. And that includes everything. Everything is present at hand. And if it's not, then it's just, irrelevant. That is a searing indictment of our basic foundational civilizational ethic, at least in the West. When you really think about it, I think that's just such a chilling prospect of considering everything as potential sources of profit, which explains capitalism and our monopoly business practices and just our relationships to nature and the world and each other, and relationships to other Dasein. But once you really get that, you realize, wow, this is such a limited viewpoint of the human experience, human nature, and this is an important concept that we all should consider. Maybe not bring it to the conclusions Heidegger himself specifically came to, but we do need to think about how we treat the natural world and ourselves and our place in it in a way other than the way we've been enculturated and trained by the society and world and civilization that we've been born into.
You know, when he talks about time, is it time like the way we usually think of time? You know,
Present at hand.
yeah, present hand. But you know, when he says present hand, I think is he talking about a kind of time in existence in our present day existence that is, you know, not being but becoming. You know, right? He's being and time. You know, but he's talking about in an existence, Dasein in existence in the world that is constantly changing, right?
We're at the point, James. You don't really need to raise your hand. Just go ahead. Just go ahead and.
I'll interrupt someone. That sounds wonderful.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
because he's I
Very
know
Dasein
he likes,
We've got our rhythm down by now, everybody.
because he likes Heraclitus a lot, right? Heraclitus, you know, the Greek who believed that everything was changing. You can't step in
Yummy.
the river twice, you know, and that the river of life, you know, is constantly flowing. And so he's talking about time, you know, it's a kind of a flow, right? That is constantly changing. So he's trying to find something present at hand in that flow, right?
Yeah, we haven't really covered the temporality and time parts of the book, the ones that are just devoted to temporality and time, but we have a lot of clues already. He talked about care as being authentic care, as putting yourself ahead of someone else, of another person. So when you don't just sort of like take the inauthentic care would be taking the place of another person, putting yourself in the place of another person, and possibly accomplishing their task for them, or you know, or to sort of go through a task with them and be ready to take credit, you know, for having participated. But authentic care would be going ahead. So going ahead implies going ahead in time. So we're not just next to the person, but we're actually ahead of them. We might be mentoring, we might be furthering their project, but the care is authentic. The other, and it seems to have a time relationship to me. The other word is foreconception. He talks about interpretation being composed of having, foresight, and foreconception, rather. And those words in German actually have other meanings. The forehaving means I always forget. It means intention. So we have the intention of something. So having the intention implies that it's going to be in the future already. So in interpretation, we have a futuristic look. We have the foresight, which means that we are not only looking at what is present at hand, but we're also looking into the future. We're looking into the future of existence, of our existence in the world, and then and even of things in the world, and that counts. And then finally, anticipation, which is Vorgriff in German, which means which is translated in the book to foreconception, but it actually has a translation of anticipation, and then he uses anticipation in some of these chapters that we're discussing today. So anticipation means, you know, basically understanding that the world is what can happen in the world is ahead of what is happening right now. Also that anticipating what we might have to be in the world in the future. So anticipating a future state of affairs in which we become involved in, get entangled in. Their entanglement can mean more with interpretation than just with our interpretation than just sort of like surviving the totality of things that are present, or the totality of worldliness. So he's introducing us to futuristic thinking already. The last part of the book does a lot of. It's not that long. Well, I guess there is a last part of the book is like another 50, 60 pages maybe. So with beyond what the existentialism book covered. And this book takes us all the way up to being unto death, and the call to conscience, and guiltiness, which is a very Nietzschean concept, I think. So that's why I think that's probably why David was moving towards Nietzsche at this point, because it seems to make it might make some sense to go in a Nietzschean direction at this point in the study. So that's all. I have. I recorded about 35 notes, 39. So I recorded a lot of notes, but that's basically the introduction to how he uses time. He says Dasein uses history and time, and that Dasein's life is a potentiality for being a whole. So that means a lot. If we are a potentiality for being a whole, it's kind of like, well, why aren't we already full? You know, it's like, how do we fill ourselves up? And what are we going to use to fill ourselves up? And the answer is basically the anticipation of our own finitude, the anticipation of our own death. So I'll just throw it out there, and other people can talk about that. Because I think there's a lot of there's a lot of personal experiences in me that I can relate to this idea of being unto death, and being towards death. Yeah. So the final ontological formulation that he uses is that is the most fruitful, is being towards death. We are actually, even though we might be in our 20s or 30s, and we consider ourselves young, and we consider ourselves far from our death, we actually are being towards death. And this is a clue. This actually shows us how to be, this is a way of showing us how to be authentic through what Matt was talking about in the lecture. What is it?
Anxiety, angst, finitude.
There you go. Anxiety and resoluteness. So creating a clearing for anxiety, experience anxiety, even getting to the point where, like, we have a clearing. We have a space. We have a special space in our hearts for anxiety. And then a resoluteness, which is heeding the call of guilt. So that's really saying a lot, almost too much. I just want people to talk about their own experiences and feelings about being towards death.
Oh, I was thinking of the classic medieval film story, The Seventh Seal.
Yeah.
Where a guy comes back. Disillusionment, of course, is a huge element. As you get older, you get a bit more disillusioned, don't you? The dreams of youth haven't quite worked out the way Hollywood told us they'd work out.
Yeah, it wasn't made in Hollywood, that's for sure. How many people have seen that movie? That's a key cultural icon, Seventh Seal. Not too many?
Very famous movie.
There you go, Audrey.
I haven't seen it.
Our generation. Love it.
I have a long list of movies I'd love to see someday, but yeah, I haven't seen that one. But yeah, that's a very famous movie.
Because that's the American culture is famous or bypassing the tragedy. It's always a happy ending, you see. So
Hollywood blockbuster
whereas-
movies.
Whereas Europe has a tragedy. Oh, I think the most famous case was that Dutch film, The Vanishing. They created an American version of it where the hero succeeds, played by Bruce. Oh no, Bruce Willis was the bad guy. That's right.
So anyone
But it's an
want to talk?
interesting element in the American character, that desire not have the tragedy.
Okay. Anyone want to talk about being in time, or specifically the
Well,
the ideas that we're talking about?
Yeah, what's interesting about Heidegger's presentation of the concept of our contemplation of our finitude, our contemplation of our mortality, brings us to a place of anxiety and angst. And he uses that as a method. He uses that as a tool to throw us into a place where we can renegotiate our way of living and way of thinking. You know, how could we live differently? How could we reconceive things? It's not something I expected when I began this, but that's very hopeful determination at the end here, because you can renegotiate, you can reconceive. How do you live? How are we supposed to live? How could we potentially live? What other choices are there, which we can't do when we're in that fascinated, Benommenheit is the German, but fascinated. I would say stunned. You're just in that zombie that Matt was talking about. That zombie daily, quotidian, going along with the crowd, where you're just not questioning anything. That cotton candy bubble, which is what most people are. In order to get unstuck from that, in order to get into a new place, anxiety is one way of doing it. Angst is one way to do it. And one way to do that is to contemplate your death, contemplate your finitude. Yeah, consider the fact that, yeah, you have a checkout date. You don't know when it is, but you do have a checkout date. Could be next week, could be 15 years from now, could be 30 years from now. But you are going to check out and then realize, well, do I really want to spend all day playing video games? Is there something I could be doing today? Is there something I can do this week or this month or this year? What do I want the next couple of years of my life, when I'm in 10, 20 years of my life, to look like? If I think about it in that way, that's actually a very, very hopeful, very positive, very supportive, encouraging message, I feel. And I didn't expect to get to that point from studying Heidegger, but here we are.
Well, I didn't either, and I was really excited by that. But and actually for the last couple of readings, but this, there was a question tonight in the lecture from somebody that was, and I think it was maybe closer to the end, where he was talking about, where somebody asked, is this something that is just for the individual as opposed to your society, or is he being hopeful about the society? And he was saying, and Matt was saying that Heidegger was talking about you, the individual, but definitely there's that. And he went into this whole section about how you can say to a Dyson, you can do something better. That part was a little tricky for me. I didn't know if he was saying, are we judging that other people are doing it right, or giving them suggestions, or saying that there are other ways without giving the blueprint of what those other ways are, without trying to proselytize your own crap, or your own belief system. But that there are other ways, and you can investigate it for yourself. I found that interesting.
Audrey, I think that's something that is both true and false. Heidegger talks a lot about Dasein's inner call. So there's an inner call that comes to you out of anxiety, and the preparation for the inner call is being unto death. But I think he leaves it open that, because we are discourse, so because we are discourse, we can, contact other Daseins and become a calling to them. One of the things that Heidegger doesn't do very well is that exact type of calling. He spends he has way too many sections and chapters and divisions and parts to actually be a calling to someone to improve themselves or be a more authentic being. Although that's all he really talks about, is those possibilities. And he uses the language all the time of possibility. In other words, he doesn't ever say, you're going to have to be this or you're going to be a that.
Right. No, I understand that.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to get at what Matt was talking about when he was saying
Sure.
that that's you either pick out the Dysons that you can give this, you can
Right.
push along or something. I didn't quite understand where he was coming from.
I don't think there's any passage in Heidegger in this book, I don't think there's any passage in Being in Time where Heidegger says we're now going to start marching and everyone is going to choose a city.
And Matt was very clear about that. It was just this one section about just nudging others. And I don't know if it was in your inner circles or what.
Yeah.
Didn't he call that conscience?
Yes, he called it conscience.
Conscience, right.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
you can appeal to someone's conscience the way reading. I think it's like Nietzsche, it's like this idea of being guilty. Heidegger says we are all guilty, and we kind of have an absolute guiltiness. There's almost no relief from our guilt. So that's the idea of. That's my idea of filling the potentiality of being a whole and filling yourself up. You've got all this guilt. The only thing that can possibly resolve out of all that guilt is actually becoming resolute. So,
So what I think he's accomplished is he's opened up the possibility of possibilities, which in itself is pretty radical. I mean, he's given us the framework and the opening to say, oh, there are possibilities, and here's how you open up the possibility of possibilities. And I think what he's done is he's demonstrated Unschlossenheit, the world disclosure that he talks about. He's just shown us what that is, and it's hard, and it has to be done very, very precisely. Revealing one distinction after another for it to be comprehensible, because he's talking about something that it's interconnected, it's a network, and presented out of the blue is incomprehensible. That's why it's hard.
Yeah, he says. You go ahead.
I don't know much about Heidegger, honestly, but so Heidegger is the existentialism philosophy. So to him, human beings are beings in the world, and being in the world has to have a relationship with all kinds, only except God. God is not in the world. According to Heidegger, if I am wrong, maybe Lucas, anyone of you correct me, but Heidegger is, he removed God out of the human existentialism. So we have a right to do, we have the responsibility on our own existential life. That is why he had to talk about anxiety. If we have a God, yes, we probably have to be dominated by God. So God takes care of all things. Then our life We are destined to something. So I don't need to worry about my life. I don't need to worry about my what to be in the future. So when we talk about God, it is determinism. Everything's all set. God control everything. So there's no anxiety. But Heidegger absolutely kicked out God out of human existentialism. So we have anxiety. Because we
Existentialism.
also looking for the meaning of life. We want to yes, we have to take responsible for our own life. So potentiality is the way we can live in this world. That makes Aristotle also talks about potentiality. That is the energy to grow us, move us to reach out to the goal, the finality.
Yeah, I think existentialism begins, without God. That's how existentialism starts, right? Is that the beginning of existentialism is the recognition that there is no God, and from there, the individual has to decide what to do, right? Individual has to decide what is the being that will replace what God gave other people, the meaning before. But now, in the age of existentialism, we have to recognize that we have to create our own meaning, our own being.
Well,
That's
Jamie,
what I'm saying.
Right.
There were some existentialists that prior to Heidegger that called themselves Christians, like Kierkegaard, for example.
Right. But he only became, he was a Christian, but he had to take a leap of faith from the existence. He had to reach that point where he took a leap of faith towards God.
So are you saying that that was an abandonment of God or something?
No,
Is that what you're saying?
Began with the fact, a recognition of his existence, and that if you wanted to believe in God, you had to take a leap from that existence of your individuality and your recognition of your existence without any
that was
assumption.
That was the way of, yeah.
Is that right?
I was going to say that, yeah. This, I think he's commenting on how to reconcile this idea that existentialism is kind of anti-God with Kierkegaard's theism, and so he begins with absurdity, and he does this incredible inversion, Kierkegaard. So in philosophy, we naturally connect presence with intelligibility. In fact, for Plato, intelligibility is the essence of presence. Kierkegaard recognizes that intelligibility means digestibility. And once you digest being into your internal understanding system of inference, and you have all these sentences chained up together in these infinite chains, then something's been lost, because the principle of sufficient reason means that you can always go back forever. So he says that the absurdity of Christianity was the idea that the infinite God can become incarnate in a piece of meat and go through all these silly concrete adventures. The absurdity that Abraham had to be in when God told him that he would inherit, that he'd be the father of nations and kill his son. So Kierkegaard was so funny. He would take these really strong absurdities, like A, you will have no children, and B, you will be the ancestor of 1,000 nations. And using this as a virtue. So now paradox and absurdity for Kierkegaard become virtuous. And so this is his funny way of bringing God into existentialism. He thinks that God is the absurd that can't be handled. Right. He said that if your understanding of ultimate reality or being or presence is digestible in the way Hegel likes, so that you can really subsume it with your concepts and put it inside your web of inference and understanding, then it's like a thread that has no knot, and it'll be pulled all the way through because we have this ability to ask why. So anyway, so Kierkegaard recommends a leap of faith, but he also begins by inverting absurdity and saying, well, that's got to be God. The thing that you can't digest is, if God were understandable, then we would be greater than him. We would transcend him and put him inside of our map. So God has to be this ridiculous thing, a God man like Jesus, or a paradox like killing your son and inheriting all these children. Hey, that's just a.
So you're saying that,
it seems strange that Kierkegaard would be an existentialist and a theist at the same time.
Right.
Yes,
But
yes.
you're saying that he begins with questioning God, right? That you're saying that it's an absurdity first, right?
That's right. Remember, he does social, ethical, religious. He says that if anyone in any church today stood up and said, God just told me to murder my son,
Right.
there's no way they wouldn't call the police.
Sure,
there's
right.
no way that he wouldn't be institutionalized. It's impossible. So,
Right.
so this is, no one takes these stories seriously, but he tried to. And by trying to, it was like looking at Cthulhu and creates a kind of a madness. So Kierkegaard wanted to create the madness of this type of faith where on one hand, you're a fishmonger, but on the other hand, you're a brother of Christ, right? He talks about there. Yeah, it's
right. His existential choices, he had to go through these three different stages, right? The aesthetic, ethical, and then the religious, right? So he had to, continually ask himself all these questions, explore all these different ways of deciding what to do, right? Regarding his, whether to marry or not to marry, and so forth. And he had to go through these different stages, the aesthetic and then the ethical, and then comes to the religious as to deciding whether to take the leap of faith or not, right?
Kierkegaard, yes,
Jamie.
definitely Christian existentialist, but I think he also shared the same concept as Heidegger.
Or he shared the idea of the absurd and questioning life and so forth, and I think he shared the notion of maybe the nausea or the anxiety, perhaps, right?
Yes, why is existentialism is exist. Exist means exist from God. So Kierkegaard was Christians, but before you think about Hegel talks about the unlimited and the limited. It's God and humanity, and then those must be unification. God and humanity can be unification. That is the human essence. So until Hegel, the human essence has a divinity or God's essence in our human life. So they emphasize, so the modernist philosophers until Hegel emphasize on episteme or intellectual things. But Kierkegaard or Heidegger, they separate themselves from God. So Kierkegaard say that we are being in front of God. We couldn't jump out to God. We have to live in Christ's grace. But still, we'll never be unified with God. And then Heidegger kick out God. Go ahead, we don't have a God in the world. So since then, existentialism emphasized on how to live. So before it was intellectualism, but after there is how to live. But without God, there's
Jamie, guys, we could talk all night about other philosophers, but I'd like to bring this down to Heidegger and try to make this as exclusively about Heidegger as possible. I had my own question for Scott, but Jamie, it seems like you're willing to pop in a question any place, so it's kind of hard to get a word in, so I'll leave that question out. I want to get back to my answer to this question of disclosure that was brought up. The conscience, it's conscience or consciousness that gives us conscience is the ability to distinguish, probably the ability to distinguish values, right? But and it's what gives us something to understand. That's the disclosure that I think Warren was talking about. So the state of disclosedness is constituted by state of mind, understanding, falling, and discourse, according to Heidegger. So this opens up a whole new structure. The idea that mood and the state of mind of Dasein, Dasein's understanding, Dasein's falling, always falling, and discourse, which is generally available to Dasein even if it's part of his own consciousness. In other words, the self-questioning. That that structure of care is or the structure of disclosedness is really what distinguishes Dasein as being in the world.
Okay.
So and they're inside the mode of discourse. There's calling, which is an appeal to Dasein on its own most potentiality for being. So this is a really important concept in this part of the book. One's own most potentiality for being is itself is being summoned to it by its own most being guilty. So he says here that it's guilt, not any kind of like leap or anything like that, but it's Dasein's almost being guilty, which is summoning it to discourse through a calling, what he calls a calling. So and this is kind of like this is very much like a guiltiness that brings one to a understanding of one's own potentiality. And that potentiality is being a totality, being its own totality. Because Dasein, in its natural state, carries a lack of totality. Dasein is constantly, in the sense that we are constantly a not yet. We don't think it's time to die. We know that we're going to die, but there's an unreadiness to hand and a lack of togetherness in Dasein that causes him to that basically constitutes a not yet, which basically haunts, has a which basically is kind of this let me see, which constitutes its possibility of being a totality. So he says the look of humans is it that we are essentially harvesting our own death, as opposed to maybe as opposed to some animals. But if we don't own our not yet, we are staving it off. And to me, this is like a hungry bird. So a hungry bird is when it sees a morsel of food, it looks twice. And the reason it's looking twice at the morsel of food before it flies over to grab it is because he's trying to distinguish the morsel of food from death. He might have a consciousness of death, and that's why he's looking twice at the morsel. Yeah, so that's all. I'm kind of like interested in what people have considered about being towards death, because this is an idea that at least I consider it to be pretty unique in Heidegger.
I think
And
consciousness
it is the
itself-
possibility, he calls it the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. And this is really an important concept, the idea of nullity. He says the nullity here is what causes us to anticipate our own anxiety about death. Go ahead.
So when you say the word totality, what do you mean by that, totality?
Mm-hmm. Totality means that totality is here the totality of let me get that. Totality of expectations, totality of oh, I see. Totality of being. It's a totality of being. So in other words, Dasein as a being has a potential for being a totality. And that's really what Heidegger is getting at here, that probably no other philosopher has ever done, is to call Dasein a totality of a potentiality for being the totality of its own being.
That sounds a little bit ominous, like you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, like, you say it's ominous,
yes,
but
sounds like
you say it's ominous, but what it means is, in other words, we are conscious. We are conscious. So our consciousness is an ability to see all the aspects of our being, and to have interpretations of all the aspects of our being. He says that interpretation begins in the world. So it's not of the world itself, but it's of Dasein. Dasein interprets the world based on his own understanding.
So it doesn't mean does it mean completeness, a sense of completeness?
Yeah, completeness, totality in the sense of completeness.
So, okay.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, just like earlier in the book, he talked about a totality of relevance. The totality of relevance is what projects us to understanding the world, because we understand there's a totality of relevance of things at hand to ourselves, which enables us to formulate the projects and the possibilities of projects that we can accomplish. So the totality here you're talking about the totality of existence itself,
right,
as a projection upon our own death.
So the inauthenticity would be a false sense of totality, or
Causality?
a false sense of totality.
No, I don't think so. The authenticity is the call of the they.
Right.
In other words, the inauthenticity is the call of the they. It's the idea that
but you could feel a sense of totality by responding to the calling of the they, right? You're inauthentic, but you can still have a sense of totality.
Yeah, you could have a sense of totality, but would it really be an authentic sense
right.
of totality?
So that's what I mean.
In other words, if we were sort of like listening to
right,
the they 24/7,
sure,
and just basically not being engaged with our own possibilities and our own projections, would we actually become a very satisfying totality? It would just be the normal everyday totality, which is already Dasein, according to Heidegger.
Well, it seems like it's kind of ironic that Hannah Arendt, Heidegger had a relationship with her, right? And she's the one who wrote about totalitarianism as a threat to our humanity.
Yeah,
and
but this is a different kind of totalitarianism.
Right. So he's using a word like totality, which can be an inauthentic kind of totality, right? which you are, seduced by the they, and will lead you to join forces with a totalitarian regime, right?
Well,
So in
that
other
would,
words,
that would not be, that wouldn't, I mean, that would be part of yourself,
right.
But I would say that it would be more likely to be the call of the they, or be classified that way, as the call of the call from within, or the call from guilt. One of the things that happens, I don't know, I didn't want to talk about Heidegger's connection with Nazism, because it's like something that definitely Matt in the lectures addresses a lot. But I think my own take is that when you're in a condition of war, when you're in a condition of war, and you're looking at your own death in an authentic way, then you might feel that part of being fulfilled in your being towards death is actually to be a soldier. In other words, if one were going to join the army and there was a war and you were patriotic or wanting to sacrifice for others in a war, one of the things you might think of doing would be joining up, so to speak, joining the army. And of course, Heidegger by that time was way too old to join the army. But one of the things that he could do was join the Nazi Party. So that's kind of like something I thought of thinking about Matt's lecture today. When I listened to it today, I was listening to Matt's lecture, and I was thinking, that might be it. It might be this kind of like patriotism that I could be guilty of. That anyone could be guilty of patriotism.
Right. That's exactly what I was referring to. That anyone could be seduced by the they, right? And thinking that would be the right way to go.
Well, that's not necessarily a seduction, I don't think. In other words, that might be coming from authenticity.
No, but it's a decision that you make, whether you and you wouldn't know whether you were being authentic or not when you make that decision.
Sure,
right?
Sure. Like you might be wanting to have a girlfriend.
Exactly right.
And the girlfriend only dates guys in uniform.
Sure.
So that's why you join the military. Yeah, that happens.
Yeah, but he's the one that's talking about.
Wait, guys. I mean, this is a conversation between the two of you. There's many of us here.
Yeah, go ahead, Audrey.
But it also could be something to do with the fact that he wanted to teach. I mean, I don't know how important it is to know or to even care that he joined the Nazi Party. He was somebody that gave us a way to look at the way we're living. His choices for himself, they don't affect me at all, because it was his choice, and I think a very misguided one. But and it might have to do with patriotism, which again is a problem, I think, in general. I think it colors things a certain way. You're looking at something from a framework, which is part of the they. I also think that, that there's this sense that in order for me to be heard, in order for me to be taught, in order for me to feel that I have a will to something, I'm using my will, I want to be able to teach, and I can actually maybe move this movement into something else. Some people might think that's really arrogant. Other people might think that that's one way to figure this out. It doesn't matter what he ended up doing. He gave us, I think, those of us who weren't maybe too spiritual, because I mean, you can go to the East for a lot of working with your mind and looking at the different options and ways of being in the world without, succumbing to Heidegger's view. But he's just giving us possibilities, which Matt was constantly talking about. Just
I agree with
look at yourself. have the possibilities. These are your possibilities. I'm not going to give you a blueprint, and then forget what he did after that.
Well,
So what I was trying to outline is how this can be both authentic or unauthentic.
Yeah.
In other words, it can be totally authentic if it's actually coming from your own project. You have a project, like you said. If the project where I can't teach without it, well, maybe that could be true, and maybe that was part of it, but it doesn't sound too authentic. My idea was the idea that occurs to a lot of people who are patriotic or kind of drawn up into a war. You're in the war, and you might actually want to you might want to see, because you're basically, for Heidegger, you're always dying. You're basically you're always in the state of not yet. That's not a totally inauthentic state. The not yet. We're always in a not yet. All of us are not a being unto death. In other words, we're all not yet. We're all going to die. But and we're kind of like in the background. We're always conscious of the not yet. But and that really comes up. That comes to the fore. When we have a family member or a friend die or something like that, that starts to count. That's why I was kind of asking for people to comment, because I know that everyone has probably had some experiences like that. But so there is a authentic being unto death, which is he calls being towards death, and
I think the most interesting.
Well, part of that. Just let me finish. The part of that is is basically understanding that there are different modes of different modes of being. Just like there are different modes of being, there are many possibilities for death. I know a guy that died at Disneyland. So I mean, it's all kinds of crazy stuff can happen. And one of the obvious kinds of ways of being is being a soldier. And he doesn't talk about that. He doesn't discuss being a soldier, but that's something that's very important in the Hindu religion. It's the second most popular caste in India is the soldier, Avanta or whatever it's called. So being a soldier is a kind of a way of being, and it could be an authentic way of being. Go ahead.
Sure. But it's more than But he was more than being a soldier. He was joining becoming part of a ideology that was anti-Semitic, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And racist and so forth. And so I guess my interest in trying to explore that is, why did he think that way? If it's his thinking was so smart and his philosophy is so great that helps us, can it help us, make a better decision?
He recognized the importance of irrational elements in a culture, actually for reasons similar to like we were talking about a second ago with Kierkegaard. Yeah. So there's these infrarational, emotional, poetic things that have nothing to do with inference in truth. And then but earlier you asked about you were interested in this death, being towards death, the relationship of being towards death towards consciousness. And I just wanted to point out that for me the most interesting part of Heidegger is the fact that he recognizes that the self itself, consciousness itself, is a death postponement mechanism. It's that's how it came into existence. You have these cell colonies, and they have to coordinate, and the coordination works well when it feels panic. Panic and fear is what makes the organism move. It's what causes it to expend energy to go from one place to another. So consciousness originates, and by consciousness I mean this Kantian consciousness that sees itself in a body, and that the body's in a space, and things happen in time, and it takes time to travel distance. So this is how consciousness is born. It's born with an understanding that it's in space, and that distance along the z-axis is time, and it knows how long it can live by seeing the distance from the predator. So,
but none of that has anything to do at all with being in time, does it, Scott?
What do you mean? Yeah,
I've read Being in Time, twice. I've never seen anything about those ideas about consciousness, being born that way, or even in some of those ideas about space and so forth. It sounds more like Kantianism than it does Heidegger, and Heidegger, rejected a lot of what Kant wrote about.
Didn't he also?
When Heidegger says that being towards death and anxiety are constitutive of consciousness, right, he's saying just this. He's not being poetic. I'm just saying that it's nice that a biological fact concords with Heidegger on the claim that the very ability to have an outwards facing, towards the world facing intentionality is death. Death is why you have an ego center. So death and pain and anxiety are the motives for having a consciousness. In fact, they're even prior to consciousness.
Okay, well, those are generalities. And what Heidegger said is that it's not that what was it? You said something is constituted of consciousness. So anyway, he said that Dasein is always conscious, and that consciousness of death and possibility and so forth, those are constitutive of Dasein. Dasein being a being, and he was really interested in separating and discriminating these various characteristics of being, discriminating being from consciousness, discriminating being from and making sure that all of these discriminants were basically put in the correct place. That was his whole methodology. So that's all. I just wanted to complain that he didn't say that. He said that these are constitutive of Dasein, and that consciousness is something that always exists in Dasein.
That's right. That's right. The fact that we have this Dasein situated, spatially focused consciousness, that's death constituted. Yeah, and then there's a generic consciousness that's other than that. But yeah, if you're facing space in a way that particularizes and has things ready in hand, potentially dangerous and all this other stuff, you have an attitude already. You already have an attitude. I mean, so self-preservation is the attitude.
Yeah, an entanglement. Yeah. Okay.
In the early part of the book, didn't he talk about phenomenology as a method?
He talks about it in this part of the book. Phenomenology. One of the interesting things about this part of the book, in this segment of the study, is that he switches. He switches back to a phenomenological approach from the ontological approach, and back and forth. So he actually announces, he says, we're going to look at this now, examine this from a phenomenological point of view. He did that before, he does that earlier in the book, but he's doing that quite a bit here, switching back and forth from a phenomenological analysis to a ontological analysis. And he's also like letting out of the bag a little bit that he's a Hegelian. He classifies things by the different aspects of the different into their basically static and potential. I forget exactly what he says, but it was kind of interesting. I don't think I made a note about it though. Yeah, here it is. No, that's not it. No. Anyway, So I didn't make a note about it. I forget exactly what he says, but it's he doesn't mention Hegel, but he has a very Hegelian sounding clause in one of these chapters.
Yeah, because he begins with a phenomenological method of investigation, right? Because he was a student of Husserl, was a phenomenologist, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's he was actually a postdoc for Husserl.
Yeah.
So being involved in that at that level, he was very familiar with Husserl's methodology and what Husserl expected, and he was also like the prize student. He was co-publishing with Husserl at the time he wrote Being in Time. So he talks about the inauthentic. Basically, he says Dasein is afraid of anything absurd, which is interesting because that basically touches on fear, and it touches on the absurd, which I guess is something that comes up in some other authors, like Camus and so forth.
Oh, that's where
and then
got that word. Huh?
So but I wanted to touch on this one idea that I think is very resonant. He says that life must be understood as a kind of being to which there belongs a being in the world. Now, I think what he means by that is that we have understanding. It's Dasein that has understanding. So if we want to understand life, which we actually participate in, we're either alive or we're dead. Death is the possibility of the impossibility of being. So the life being a kind of being to which there belongs a being in the world means that we understand our own being alive. That's his point. So I thought that was pretty kind of fairly interesting, an interesting feeling expression. Death is a possibility of being which Dasein has to take over in every case. So in other words, we can't be without our death. We could not be aware of our death possibly, but in other words, we could be too young to contemplate death, but that's a fairly young age. Most of us, by the time we're somewhere in between 4 and 7, we become conscious of death. So and it's probably even earlier now because of culture. So the death is a possibility of being which Dasein has to take over in every case. Death is the possibility of being no longer able to be there. So in other words, Dasein itself, by Heidegger's definition of being there, can no longer be there. If Dasein stands before itself as this possibility, however, it has been fully assigned to its ownmost potentiality for being. So so he's basically saying that death is all important to Dasein. In other words, trying to sort of like have some other discussion is actually the purpose of the they. The they wants to have this other discussion and deflect the discussion about death. And that's why so many of these chapters are devoted to death and being in time. Also, it's a springboard because death is a springboard for anticipation. And anticipation is basically the number one characteristic probably of what Heidegger calls temporality, when we're aware of the importance, becoming aware of the importance of temporality in our own consciousness. It goes beyond death. And of course, it's not covered in the reading because the reading stops before the end of the book, so we don't actually read what Heidegger's whole approach to temporality and a number of other concepts. And you could also think of death as absolute self-identity, because you can't have any relationship. In other words, if you don't believe in an afterlife. If you believe that an afterlife is going to happen soon, or it's going to happen eventually, or something like that, then you could certainly say, well, we're going to have relations in the future. There's going to be a future, but because somebody mentioned before that Heidegger is almost thoroughly atheist in philosophy. Now he's atheist from a philosophical perspective, like other philosophers are atheist from a philosophical perspective. And that's kind of since Nietzsche. Since Nietzsche, the philosophers never feel any compulsion to talk about religion, because he's freed it from those. And actually, it's even before Nietzsche, with the idealists, the German idealists, all the way back to Kant. And before Kant, Wolff, to a certain extent, who was an atheist, didn't feel it was necessary or they fought against the impulse to bring God into the discussion of philosophy. So that began probably with Wolff, and then it carried forward through Kant to other philosophers, and probably came to its culmination in Nietzsche, who grew up in a religious household and rebelled against it, and felt that he had to write about resistance. He had to write manuals basically for resistance to religion, essentially, as part of his calling. Perhaps that's downgrading Nietzsche a bit, but so I apologize if I did that. But he definitely found himself in a very special place regarding himself as a rejectionist of God.
Do you think that he was rebelling, or do you think that he was observing that was already happening?
His father, well, he's observing it. He's in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, when there were lots of atheists around. Right. But his father was a minister. That's all I'm saying. Right. A very strict minister, too. Right. Yeah. So anyway.
So he said that, that God is dead, or we killed God, or something like that, or. That's right. The death of God.
Yeah, we killed God. We have blood on the knife. Yeah.
And there will be never enough water.
You're an asshole just like me. We all killed God.
And there'll never be enough water to wash away the blood.
Yeah. It's gone. It's over. Forget it. Okay. And the way that they replies to death is by covering up and tranquilizing and and so forth. The being towards the end is coming face to face with the absolute impossibility of existence. And I think that's a really important concept. In other words, there's a nullity that Dasein has in his mind, and that would be the impossibility of his own existence. And that nullity is not very pleasant because it's absurd. And that nullity in itself, for Heidegger, causes anxiety. And anxiety for Heidegger is like the #1 springboard into authenticity and anticipation of a authentic future. Even if it's only this level, even if it's only being unto death, but the idea that you can actually project an authentic future for yourself is kind of a little bit inspiring. So that's his idea, is that the projecting an authentic future is coming face to face with the absolute impossibility of existence. And he says, and he loves these sentences. For the most part, everyday Dasein covers up the ownmost part of its being, that possibility which is non-relational and not to be outstripped. Dasein as factical is in the untruth. So in other words, that's our everyday relationship with death, with being with the not yet, or our actual, even recognizing our own existence as being unto death, and having some level of concern about it, whether we're actually going to create a religion about it, or join a religion about it, or join the Nazi party, or whatever. You know, that's all kind of like basically our own kind of like genuine but authentic or inauthentic projections. And we already talked about the possibility of authenticity and the possibility of inauthenticity in regards to decisions in the face of death. So
Matt was saying that yeah, you not only have to deal with, you know, acknowledge your own death just once, but you have to do it every day.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not a one-time thing. That you have to remind yourself of that in order to live authentically. Is that true?
I don't see anything wrong with it. I did want to talk about. There's a song I have. Has anyone heard the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Paul Simon.
Paul Simon.
So anyway, you have like in that song, it's a brilliant song, and it has the death. It has the death in the song. It has the death cadence, like a major, minor, major, or something like that. So or minor, major, minor, kind of like cadence in it, which is which echoes back to Chopin, Death March, and all that stuff. You know, so it has the death cadence in it, and which means like the end of the verse has the death cadence. The chorus is just strictly hip hop, where he talks about the 50 ways, the fact that once you've decided to leave your lover, you have the opportunity to use 50 ways. You also have 50 ways of dying, and it's a lot of fun. You can if you want to approach your death authentically, and actually consider yourself being unto death, you can pick 50 ways to die. You could die of cancer. You could die of multiple cancers. You could die in a nuclear holocaust, which I had to grow up thinking about. You could die in the army. Trying to protect your comrades. Or trying to protect your home. You could. There's like so many different kinds of. You could die at Disneyland. Not of a heart attack, but because some machine at Disneyland became unscrewed and killed you, because that happened in Adventureland when I was living around there. So the ways of dying are multiple, and you could actually have a lot of fun, in my opinion. It sounds morbid, but you can actually run the examples. You can run all the possibilities. So
you go to a party without
now we have dying of COVID, right?
Yeah.
So there's another one where we can't run out. There's just like almost an infinite number, at least 50.
There's a science fiction short story by Orson Scott Card about this the value of death as an endpoint and as the thing that defines it finalizes the defining. So there are these centipede-like creatures, and they establish churches on Earth, and what they do is they invite people to come in and die, and the centipedes gather around the humans and just weep with envy that this human has a termination, which gives like some type of it gives the reality. It imbues reality to what you do with your life. So these centipedes, it turns out that they're asexually reproduced, and their memories never stop. So the memories go back infinitely, and it's kind of like, I guess it's like an Anne Rice. It's an Anne Rice complaint, right? They're immortal, and they just, woe is me. But yes, when you realize that everything, including you, the project, maker will be terminated. I like this. I think deadlines are important. I know a lot of people that can't really work without deadlines. So if we imagine that the deadline is approaching, we might not just eat Doritos and play video games.
There's a movie about this guy who invites all his friends to his funeral, you know, and he because he wants a party for his death before he dies, because when he dies, he's not going to be at the party, right? So he wanted to be at the party for his own death.
Yep. So anyway, one of the things, I'll go forward unless somebody really needs to say something now. Go ahead, Stephen.
I just find it a bit tiring when people start talking about the Nazis or history in hindsight. If you really want to approach the question, you need to project yourself back in time to that point. Think of yourself as a Heidegger. Your nation meant something to you. At the time, and this is it, at the time, most people viewed the Marxists as the behemoth threat. And they even thought of the Nazis or the fascists, let's just say the fascists, as a necessary evil to stand up to that. You've got to remember, Europe was overrun with Bolsheviks shortly after World War I. The fascists came up with their concept saying, well, we better band together, even though we're all different, we're all going to get picked off one by one. Now, that's one thing. I think if you go back to who he was back then and look at the world from his perspective, joining the Nazis probably wasn't that out of whack. But there's the other element, that is, he dobbed on associates when he was in his role. Now, this is an interesting one. Was this a demand that came from the Nazis? Give us a few scalps. And at that point, he's starting to realise what he's dealing with, that he's dealing with something dishonourable. But I really tire of this people who approach everything with the final judgment of the jury and need to go back in time, and the jury hadn't even been assembled. The court case hadn't even really been established.
Yeah, it goes back. I agree with you. It goes back to propaganda. I mean, propaganda was in Britain and in the United States. It was really important in the Second World War. So after the Second World War, there was still a kind of a push to sort of like tell the story of a bad culture, of a culture that had gone completely wrong and had done everything wrong. Left Christianity, was like there was a book. It was called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Very bestseller, right, in the United States. I read it when I was a kid. And it told the story about how Germany had become atheist, how they moved from Christianity to being a country where the government was promoting what do you call that? The original religions of the Europeans. Pagan religion, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that the German government promoted pagan religion for all the SS at least, and so the idea that no one there could possibly be Christian because it wouldn't be such a bad country if there were Christians living there, and that was part of like the way the war was conducted. A lot of people were killed. So
I think it points to that.
It wasn't just Jews. It was about 80,000 people total, and about 20,000 of which were Russian.
There is another element, and that is we make mistakes. There's a terrible thing in people that they like to see themselves as perfect. If they've made a mistake, they like to cover it up. And from my perspective, when you do that, you betray yourself. Because who you are is your mistakes as well, and you accept it. And a lot of people like Nietzsche, even Heidegger, you get that feeling, that tremendous pride. Oh, if I've made a small error in the past, I'm going to cover it over. And I think that was particularly with Nietzsche. How often in Nietzsche's works does he admit to making mistakes?
Well, he's kind of like Nietzsche in a lot of ways is kind of like line by line, paragraph by paragraph. He didn't own up to, except when he was a student. I don't think he really owned up to being methodological, right? He sort of like said, oh, I've got an idea for a book, and I already got half of it written, and I've got this notebook here, and I'm just going to keep writing out these aphorisms, and I'll have a book finished. And some of the books are a little more methodological than the others, like Human All Too Human. I haven't read many of them. So, but that was definitely something that was lacking in him, but it was also a rejection of German idealism. In other words, he was rejecting all the previous philosophers in Germany, and at least the idealists, and that was kind of like his project. His project was to reject all the previous philosophers, reject religion as a back door to sanity, possible cause of insanity, and to try to nail a role for himself as a futurist, more or less. I see Nietzsche very much as deriving from what's his name, David Hume, not David Hume, David Hume, yeah. David Hume, the British, the Scottish guy, because he was basically picking up on emotions and attitudes and trying to project that as a philosophical method. But there's more to it than that, I understand. And perhaps we're going to be learning more about that in the coming weeks, David. Were there actual methods in Nietzsche's writings, and what methods was he using to project these interesting ideas?
So one of the things that Heidegger talked about in his interview about technology in his later years was the difficulty of understanding other people, that we don't have a significant amount of shared background. And I would argue that history does that to us as well. It's actually pretty hard for us to understand what it was like to be somebody in 1928 from our perspective here. And James, to your point about history books, I think the one you're pointing to might have been a bit of a revisionist. The winners write the history. There's another book inquiring into how did this actually happen in Germany, maybe a little more inquiringly, and it's called Ordinary People, and the conclusion there is these people were not terribly much different than us. Although we would like to think so, they weren't. And so then that gives us a chilling sense that this is a possibility, a possible way of being for all of us. And that's a little terrifying.
Well, I don't think they were, I mean, myself personally, and this is just personal, but I don't think they were all of a single mind. In other words, people that lived in Germany, that actually supported the government, that believed the propaganda, just like, Americans believe American propaganda and Chinese believe Chinese propaganda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These people were like that. They were people that kind of like believed what was being posed. In other words, we're in a war. We're trying to win some battles here. I know things are getting a little uncomfortable, but because and it went way beyond that. I mean, there was definitely the ideology, the master race, and all that stuff. So, but how many people really believed it? Probably not a majority. It was the party members. The party members probably constituted 15-25% of the population. Maybe most people were kind of like listening to the radio, trying to decide, whether they were going to be bombed that night or whether, they should expect to get to work in the morning.
Maybe it points to the risk of fallenness as a way of being. That if you don't take a stand and become aware that you can make choices here, you're going to get caught up in the being of Das Man, and it may not turn out well.
Yeah. Well, it might turn out well too. In other words, Heidegger isn't saying that there's only one way to go. He says there's a whole range, and the whole range is between inauthentic Dasein, the Dasein that's completely in line with Das Man, as you say, and on the other far end of the spectrum, there's Dasein that's busy planning his own projects, interpreting the world with as few assumptions as possible. You know, part of what's carried along with interpretation is the fact that it's fueled by assumptions, not just interpretation is not just fueled by pure knowledge and truth. We don't have that. We create truth, and the assumptions that we carry in our consciousness about, you know, our pre-assumptions and so on and so forth, that all contributes to our interpretations of the world. And the interpretations for Heidegger is everything for Dasein. In other words, you have an interpretation of the world, and it fuels all your possibilities. So he's basically saying that it's very, very important, and he explains that. I was reading something where he actually explains the relationship between. Oh, and this might be the kind of like a. This is really for me the relationship to Hegel. He talks about interpretation constituting the next round of understanding. So in other words, if we have an understanding we already have understanding of the world. And understanding begins in the world. It doesn't end there, but it can also be understanding of self. And when we understand, we can have we can have out of understanding, understanding can project possibilities. And when understanding projects new possibilities, that's when interpretation takes over. And interpretation is an already always, Werner Erhard called it already always knowing. I think it's probably in Heidegger too. So there's an already always knowing about the world which constitutes interpretation. And the interpretation is basically what feeds back. It has a feedback. There is a feedback loop. Interpretation feeds back into understanding. So once we have foresight and forehaving and foreconception, we can feed that back into our understanding of the world and of ourself, understanding of self. If we have a genuine self, if we're functioning as authentic as genuine Dasein. So our understanding of ourselves is fed by interpretation. The interpretation doesn't have to be pure, because he's not saying that interpretation is pure. Interpretation can be filled with presuppositions. So, but
always is.
But let me finish this one thing. Interpretation feeds back into understanding, and that can actually be circular. That is a circular relationship in our minds. We feed our understanding with new interpretation based on new possibilities that have been produced out of our growing understanding. And that's what's really Hegelian about Heidegger for me. That's all I wanted to say. Go ahead.
But, doesn't meaning come after interpretation, or meaningless? Whether something is, your interpretation is intelligible, it gives you a sense of meaning. But if it's not intelligible, right, then you have a sense of the absurd, right? It's a
Yeah, I suppose that's a good that's a good judgment, Jamie. If you really want to do a quick test, just check to see if something's absurd. But I think it probably goes deeper than that. Go ahead, Warren. Were you saying?
Aren't there two meanings to? Aren't there two aspects to the word meaning here? So one of them is our concernful engagement with something, and the other one is the intelligibility or the understanding of it. I think there's really two different concepts that we're trying to catch there.
Well, what was the first one again?
It's our concernful engagement. Something means something to you.
Oh,
It's meaningful.
Yeah, no, I disagree.
Yeah.
I disagree.
No?
Yeah, I didn't read anything that concernful engagement is meaning. That meaning is concernful engagement. Meaning is, for me, is meaning. I don't think he has that kind of like definition anywhere. I have a Heidegger book, and I can check real quick to see if I have a definition for meaning, but that's it's not something that
It may be
think
just
I've
a
come
question of
upon.
picking the word, because like if I listen to music
Yeah.
and I bring my concerns to it, I may be moved. I may find that music meaningful,
Right.
and but that's an English word, so it may not translate perfectly.
Well, I think if you find culture meaningful, or if you find music meaningful, it's basically created by ourself. You know, in other words, our self creates that meaning, and it's not the engagement by itself that produces the meaning, but it's understanding the music, like Beethoven, for example. It's when we understand why we like Beethoven, or understand why we like Paul Simon, or why we prefer Running the Jewels. Whatever our understanding is, that's what creates meaning for us. So and you can call it taste. You could say, you're reducing meaning down to the level of taste, but we don't need too many words. You know, we could have one word, and the word and the actual and in every case, I think meaning can come out of understanding. We can do kind of like hermeneutical searches of being in time, or more if you like, but you know, like all of his interviews and all of his future books, you know, like people do that. But if you want to do a hermeneutical search of being time, that's really easy. You just take the book, you know, and find go to the index, the German index or the English index, if you've got one of those. If you've got the original Quarry translation, that has a German index as well as an English index, or you could use if you've got the new translation by Stambaugh, John Stambaugh, you can there's only an English index, but you could find basically every time he mentions meaning, and I'm sure there's a lot of them. It's going to be like a half a page. So, but you have the possibility of becoming an expert in Heidegger's definition of meaning by studying every time he mentions it in Being in Time, or in all of his works, if you like. Yeah. But I don't think that's really the purpose of studying Being in Time. By studying Being in Time, we're becoming familiar with all his hints and clues about being a Dasein, a being there, being condemned to be being in the world for a limited amount of time, and what the possibilities are, and getting in touch with all those possibilities. Hi, Shauna, so good to see you.
Yes, sorry. Oh, it's been a night. And I didn't want to interject for a bit because I didn't know I had missed a little bit at the beginning. I have to say, I always was making Heidegger I was expecting more from, no, that's not the right way to say it. I always thought he was trying to expand beyond what he was actually saying. And I realized I was doing that to him. That wasn't his fault. And I like how he talks about that while we can go to the edges, we can't really ever shake off the they. And I think that's true. Being that I'm really the only philosopher that I've given a lot of exposure, had a lot of exposure to now. I'm moving into some different areas, but it seems to me as things are slowly unfolding that some people felt like you could step outside, and he really claims here, and I can't remember the exact wording, but that idea that no, we really cannot get beyond the they. I would interpret it as that we can get radical, but still within the box. We can go to the edges and kind of peer in, but can we ever see what's outside that box? No, and I think that's what I heard him saying in this particular reading. Just thoughts on that, if anyone wants to add that and add further clarification.
You're saying we can never get beyond the they?
Yes, that we never get beyond the they, because we are the they, and the they is us, and we hang in the world together, and that we can't be beyond that. Because I always struggled with other, philosophers sort of touching on this idea that, oh yes, the notes said that this week, something like that too. Yeah. That somehow there was sort of this ability to become really like an observer of the process, but you can't really. Oh, okay.
Well, you can't get away from the they because you're right in the culture, right?
Yeah.
In your family, in your the media, you're always exposed to all that, that propaganda, or the information. So you always have to sift out, what you're gonna take seriously. Right?
Yes.
And not just go along with it, right?
Yeah, and I thought, like, even our process, how we join together right now, how we discuss material, how we use the processes of rational, our rational process has been dictated to us as well. In my opinion, I don't think it's inherent. I think we've been embedded in how we came into the world. So, I don't think we can ever release ourselves from that. We can be counter to things, but it's because we know what the thing is, so then we can be counter to it. We can say we're going to step outside of our culture, but we're really just responding to our culture still. So I did like, and for some reason I felt like there was somebody who was going to be able to take people beyond.
Well, I think the philosophy is transformational. In other words, the they is always like an anchor. The they self is like always going to be like an anchor for Dasein. The they self there's no kind of like project to extinguish the they. Authenticity is not a project to extinguish the they self. Let's put it that way. So in becoming authentic, and in selecting authentic projects, and in selecting and in taking advantage of a highly developed sense of an authentic horizon of possibility, and the potential of being unto death, the potentiality of being unto death, and the potentiality of being a whole. So there is a kind of like a tremendous level of freedom that develops. So I think, and Heidegger's very positive. He's always pushing forward, doing more and more analysis and more analysis. Never tries to pull it back all the way. He does, like if you look at the chapters, I think if you look at these chapters in this part of the book one by one, it's the sections in this book one by one, you kind of like become familiar with the fact, well, he's trying to bring up a new concept. And this new concept is a step forward. He's not getting back, he's on section 45 here, but he's not quite to section 58 yet. He's still on section 45, and he's trying to drive the project forward. This is his project. And that's the way I think we have to understand it. This is Heidegger's project. This is not how to become a good Nazi, because that, for him, that hadn't been invented yet. He didn't care about those idiots, you know. So that were rioting, so to speak. They called it a coup. What they call it, a push. Right.
First,
So that's all. I'm just thinking, you know. I mean, in answer to that, he definitely had a concept. There's something of a conception here that in becoming authentic and pursuing projects that are on Dasein's authentic horizon, which you have to make yourself. You have to create your own authentic horizon, and that comes later in the book. By the way, we're skipping. I mean, that's really a hit on Dave. David, you could reply if you want. But in having this subset of being in time to read, we're skipping some of the really good parts in the book, where he talks about what are the advantages of having anticipation, what are the advantages of having a authentic horizon as opposed to an inauthentic horizon. The foresight, the concept of foresight in interpretation is driven to its limits. So this comes later in the book.
Well, and I think one of the things that I try and always hold on to, and I see it's been posted in here, and I can almost, you know, read directly from that, but the error I was making is this idea that you could somehow suspend yourself from the culture and really find this authenticity. And really the authenticity is doing the wake up, you know, just sort of saying, hey, I realize that culture has influenced this. But you can't really fully detach, and so it's not like I'm saying, is this really novel? And I think it's just, I'll see if I can, so Lucas posted this, are we detached from culture and our projects in authenticity? Do we return back to ourselves and retrieve our core original selves, which I think is sometimes the sense that we have to
purity
find our core. Yeah, you know,
in truth, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the response is no. Rather, we assume and take responsibility for our singular, unique relation to culture and our. Oops, it's cut off here. And our. Oh, I've lost it entirely now. So I've given us a short quote there, but yeah, that it really is still in this context of the they. Like we can't get away from that, and I think that's true. I believe that's true.
But Heidegger does remind us that we are individuals. So we are not the they. We are never the they. We have a they self, which is a component of the they. So in other words, we are part of the they, but we are not the they to Dasein. We are Dasein fully. We are not the they. Other Daseins form the they, the others. We are not the others. We are purely Dasein. So in other words, if you disagree with that concept, you could write your own book. I think that would be great. You know, if somebody would actually come up with a principled attack on Heidegger based on he's got the wrong ontology. We are actually not Dasein. We are the they, and we are all the they. And that would be kind of like what was the Star Trek being that was completely every individual was wired to every other individual. The Borg. So in Star Trek there was a Borg, which was a type, a species, a race, an interplanetary species that were actually wired to think alike and have the same being, to believe that they had the same being, all had the same being. So for Heidegger, we are not the Borg. We are not the they. We are Dasein. We know there are other Daseins in the world, but the important thing about the Daseins in the world is that we are not them. They are the they. Yeah. And our project has to be entirely, we have the freedom to make our project entirely our own in every case. And the reason we can do that is because we know about our death. We have a project. We make a project out of our death. We know about anxiety. We make a clearing for anxiety. In other words, we can bring up anxiety almost on command.
But that's
So
sign
we
that
take up the project of creating and clearing from anxiety, so that we can project freedom through. We can project through the freedom of being our own totality unto death, and and in becoming that totality in a sense, which is asking a lot, but we accomplish that through doing it continuously, and then. And that just like our existence is always continuous, we just start rechanneling our existence towards that freedom.
Just a point of clarification then. My understanding was that we were both Dasein and also the they self, because I represent culture as well. I'm part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Are we not both?
Dasein is both.
Okay.
Yeah.
We read
that's sign that I
we read Freud's Civilization.
Dasein is both the self and the they self.
that sign that I know is that sign is a being. What kind of being? Being in the world. That is the sign. So previously, before Heidegger, philosophers only talk about being, but Heidegger talk about being in the world. The world is, what is the world? World is a space? No. So world is, I am in my, I'm in my room. This is my world. So when I am in the world, it means I am surrounded with all those, even my cell phone. This is a being. This is also being. My world is a being. I have a potentiality of my life. Likewise, this cell phone also has a potentiality. So if I want to have a wonderful life, I need to know my own potentiality, and I need to know my cell phone's potentiality, so I can have a better life. I need to know the potentiality of my computer. I need to know the potentiality of my neighbors, so I can make a better life. So that is the meaning of that sign. So if I'm only talking about being, I don't care about other beings around me. So there is what is that power problem. But when I consider other beings and respect their potentiality, that is how to live. But please friends, help me. So Heidegger has this kind of beautiful viewpoint, look around the world. He talks about potentiality. When we respect others' potentiality, we can make a better life. But this guy also contribute to the Nazism. Kind of dilemma.
We already talked about that, Sukchel.
So this beautiful existential concept, how can he end up with Nazism?
People change. People change. Okay? One of the things that's really famous about Heidegger is how he had something called the turning. He had a paper he wrote called The Turning, and I haven't read it yet. But the thing is that there's something in people who study Heidegger. Not only was he this existential guy, but he was also a Nazi, and he was also the guy in The Turning. He was a linguist. He was an expert on linguistics. So he completely changed his philosophy in the 1950s.
Probably he was also very patriotic, but he also talks about potentiality. So life is just not one time. We have to look at from the beginning to the whole. So and then as
the totality of relevance.
As I see myself as the whole, I talk about the other beings. Now I have to see their life as the whole. So his concept is also totality. He wants to, how can I say, in philosophical history, philosophers who talked about totality. Plato, Hegel, those people are the philosophies as the whole.
And Heidegger. And Heidegger.
And then Karl Popper said that they are the enemies of democracy. So even though Heidegger was talking about how to live, but he also followed the ancient the previous philosophers. So, okay,
but he was talking.
In
being and yeah, thank you, Sukchul. That was very, very considerate. You know, I think Heidegger was actually Heidegger was very, very concerned about methodology. He was very concerned about limiting his discussion. He wanted his discussion to be about being primarily, and not a lot of other things. He didn't want to, while he did not tell us how to live, he talked about life. He said we have a life, but just sort of like in passing, because it was the opposite of death. He really focused on one aspect of life, which is death. The other aspect of life is existence. We exist in life. We start to lose the possibility of existence, you know, in death. So that's why he was concerned about that distinction. I think what separates him from a lot of other philosophers, and I think you probably understand this, is that he understood distinction. He was able to separate being from psychology, for example. He was able to separate ontology from phenomenology very well. You know, and there's some brilliant examples here where he flips back and forth from one to the other and actually announces it. He says, you know, I'm going to move from one type of analysis to another. I wanted to read one passage for Shauna. This is where he's talking about freedom towards death, but I think it's very revealing in terms of like what you were talking about. It's only about five lines long. We'll try it. Anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they self, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, and of being itself, rather, in an impassioned freedom towards death, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the they, and which is factical, certain of itself, and anxious, capable of having anxiety. So he's being very clear here. He's saying if we adopt this mode of being in freedom, and we seek these benefits from experiencing freedom towards death, you know, the 50 ways to die that I was talking about earlier, this frees us from the illusions of the they towards being more passionate, being factical, certain of ourselves, and anxious. For Heidegger, that's the key. It's a way of being. It's not like a future for all mankind or anything like that, but it's an opening towards authenticity.
Yeah, I'm going to just throw something out here. Because with the way, sometimes I'll find words to replace Heidegger's terms. And so the they self, I'm using the word culture. And mainstream culture. What about groups or individuals? Let's talk about individuals who haven't really done well with the mainstream culture. Yes, it's the appropriate way to be, and they probably receive less negative consequences if they follow along nicely. But they're not a good fit. I mean, I don't think Heidegger actually addresses this. But that's one thing that I thought about with this whole concept of culture and the they self, is that it might not totally embrace all of the human dynamics, because there might be people that don't have anxiety. Actually, I guess it would be the anticipation that would be the driving force for them, because they want a better life. So they're definitely going to go against the they self to seek out a better promise. And that would still be, mood that would inspire them to become more authentic, to see that maybe things could be different, to be aware of where the edges are.
Well,
I'm not so
I'm
sure
sorry,
that-
I don't want to interrupt you. I was wondering if you mean like punks, maybe, or in India, if you were in India, it might be the Untouchables, somebody that was an outlaw, perhaps, or. In other words, for Heidegger, he doesn't talk about being in time. He never talks about any of those classes. He says kinds. He says there are kinds of people. But he's very careful to say this is about all kinds of people. In other words, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are. You are still a being. You still are being there. You still have a world to contend with. You have a world of relevance to contend with, as a matter of fact. Even if you're a punk, you might be a punk musician or a punk philosopher or a punk politician, like a Marxist. You still have a world.
Yeah, I was thinking of underrepresented peoples. I mean, the
Yeah.
Black Lives Movement.
There's no one Heidegger is excluding. Matter of fact, he's very purposeful about talking about being. Being is only being. In other words, when he talks about being, he even says potentially it could include plants. It could was Olaf Stapleton. It could include stars. It's like you don't have to stop your elucidation of being. You can keep it open. He keeps it open. He does not say there's good beings and bad beings, ever. He says, this is not about the goodness. He says this is not about the goodness of people. This is just simply the becoming conscious of our own possibilities as the driving force in our existence. And by analysis, what are these more productive kinds of being? How does being work? How can we work out how being works? Not the they, being. And if you say the they is cult, I don't know. The they certainly isn't culture because it's other people. So there are theys that are not relevant. Maybe about Skip Dog Jack, but Lazy E, is not someone that's not somebody you heard about before. It's not somebody in your world. So the culture is variable. It's not the same for everyone. Everyone is not walking around with the same world. We're not Borg. Sorry for using that reference again, since not everyone watched Star Trek, but we are, we're not actually closely coupled with all the humans on the planet. We just have different kinds, and some of these are the people you're talking about. Some of these attend university, take good classes. Some of them attend university just to get the piece of paper, whatever. It's all kind of like, it's always going to be the they is a big mix, but the they is always going to be in our world. It's always going to be the part of the culture that is relevant to us, and I wouldn't even say it's part of culture. For me, the culture is world. You didn't say what you were assigning culture to. Are you assigning it to the they or the world or what?
I'm assigning it. I'm using it as a term to, as a simile, or not simile, a synonym for they self. And yes,
Oh my God.
that I was born into a particular they self, which was Canadian culture or what have you, and even more specific to the province I'm in, I suppose. And then when I travel, I might come across other they selves and be aware of sort of the norms and values and what's there. And so I see like you said, a variableness with the they self, but that collective, that directly or indirectly guides me into understanding the world around me.
So I think Heidegger would disagree. He would say you were born a Dasein, with a self. You were never just a they self. You had thrownness.
I see that as well, but just like I'm not a culture, I'm distinct within that culture. I am an individual within the culture. I can abide by the cultural rules or separate myself from the cultural rules, but and so
I
then
think Heidegger is saying, if you want to understand me, you have to accept that we are beings. In other words, this is all coming from the Greeks. This is skipping over German idealism and going back to the Greeks and saying, being is what is important here. Being is indivisible. In other words, if you've got being, there's no way of saying that you're something else other than being. So we're not culture, we're being. And is there a being called culture? You could say there is. You could write a book about it. I think that's fine. In other words, you can write a book about. You can use ontological discovery to write about culture. That would be fine. But to mistake human culture for being, I think in Heidegger's sense would be wrong. You could write your own book about culture.
So
that'd be fine.
Just to clarify again, I'm not saying I'm culture, but I'm saying that when I hear the they self being described, the closest approximation I would use to my own language and my own understanding would be culture. It's how do I
okay.
So when I come into the world,
right?
Yeah, when I come into the world, it's already established, and so I understand and come to understand how to act, breathe, and so forth, because there are things in place. The world is already, there's a historicity there. So that to me is similar to the idea of culture. And by all means, there might be things where it doesn't fit neatly in that, but I'm also part of that culture. It's not like I am part of that too. Just like I'm part of the they self. And go ahead. Was somebody going to add to that?
Yeah, well, you're not part of the they self. The they self is within you. In other words, Heidegger's very, very clear about these things. They self is in Dasein. It's not something that outside of Dasein. The they is his word for what is outside of Dasein. The culture, to me, is not. When he talks about this, may be a limitation in Heidegger, where somebody else needs to write a book about the they self, and that's what you're making me think. Somebody might have to write a book about the they self, because Heidegger actually talks about the they self as a little bit invidious. He talks about the they self as being a leveling force. It's a force that's always willing to create averageness and compare yourself to averageness. So it's always making comparisons, always trying to level you down to an acceptable, culturally acceptable level. So it's not wrong for you to think about culture in regards to the they self, but when Heidegger's talking about it, he's talking about it as like an alternative to conscience. So he thinks conscience is good because it reminds you of your guilt. So that's why conscience is good. And your guilt, is an opening to a calling which leads to creating a space for anxiety and all the rest of it. So, which is kind of like a phenomenological construction that he makes. All of this, to me, is like constructive. He's doing a lot of constructions. If you're really good at philosophy, you might want to analyze claims versus constructive elements. In other words, what constructive elements going to making a claim, what claim is made, what type of analysis is there to substantiate the claim that he's making. This is all a part of philosophy and logos, which is distinct from a lot of the kinds of analysis he's making. He happens to be an expert in Aristotle. He knows everything about logos. In other words, he's ready to go toe-to-toe with another philosopher in Germany, France, wherever, that is criticizing his work and his thinking. He's dead now, so we don't have a chance. Go ahead.
Well, and I'll let Warren speak, but we might have a different idea of also what culture means, because I'm finding that the parallel's pretty strong. But Warren, please.
I think we're demonizing the they self and the background of understanding and culture. So, and maybe it's our propensity as Westerners to feel so individual and so on. It's indispensable. Nothing would be intelligible without that shared background of understanding. It's like in genetics, we're 99.9% identical genetically. And of course, we focus on the differences. But fundamentally, we are overwhelmingly, we have that shared background. And you wouldn't be able to operate in the world at all without it. So, let's not think that we're going to ever escape it. At the best, we're going to open a little window of possibilities to see what, where we can innovate, where we can be conscious, where we can be intentional, what we can choose.
Well, there's a danger, Warren. There's a danger in settling, which he talks about. In other words, if we settle for what the they self or the culture, if you want to call it that, if you
Thank you.
No, really, I'm following you. But there's a forcefulness there is a force in the they that wants us to settle. It wants us to settle. What I would say instead of culture, I would just use the word thrownness. In other words, one of the constitutive parts of Dasein is thrownness. The other ones are falling and discourse and understanding. So these, for Heidegger, this is the works. This is like, you want to talk about Dasein? We can create a structure, and this structure is Dasein. So most of what we call thrownness in Heidegger, what Heidegger calls thrownness, is they self. And I call it an anchor. So I don't know if I'm far away from you, Warren, but I call the they self an anchor. It's something that you said it roots us in the world. It gives us
foundation. It's our foundation.
Right. And I'm not a foundationalist, so I'm an anti-foundationalist. So I feel really good about that. The idea that you can have an insight into things that are not Dasein from Dasein's own constitution is wonderful. And that is like, these are all characteristics that can be turned to Dasein's, even though they misorient Dasein when he, at the beginning, they actually can work in Dasein's favor in the end, in his search for authenticity, and in reorienting his own projects towards his own potentiality for being.
So actually,
Go ahead.
authentic being is, for Dasein, is really a kind of a freedom to choose, right? He discovers that he has his possibilities. So it's a kind of freedom, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, yeah. If our choices aren't taken away, that is. Yeah.
Right. In other
That's
words,
right.
he discovers that he has these choices, and it's a kind of relief to know that.
Because what happens is the they self, or what Shauna calls the culture,
Right.
that could take away our choices. The they could take away our choices, not so much the they self, but the they themselves
Right.
could take away our choices,
Right.
and we have to be aware of that. That there's going to be some closure,
Right.
some limitations.
Right. So there's some cultures that are like traditional cultures that are very restrictive. That's very constraining, right? But but Dasein, once he faces his finitude, right, that he only has this one life to live, then he could rationally realize that he has more choices than his culture has has made him think he has, right? And I think in
that's a matter of understanding. That's a matter of how much world you have in your being.
Right.
Your being in the world.
Right.
That's why he calls it that. By the way, we're being in the world. Don't forget that.
But of course, there are some cultures that are so constrained, so restrictive that maybe Dasein doesn't have that kind of opportunity.
Now, I just wanted to mention myself.
Yeah.
Maybe the reason that we're having this conversation, I'm kind of a little animated in this particular conversation, is because I don't really believe that culture I don't believe in a fat culture. I believe in a culture that embraces the arts, possibly like the way that skills are acquired, education, the way that industry is formed, the formation of industry, the formation of economy, things like that. But there is I believe in science. So I believe that some of these entities are kind of like unto themselves, that there's a real economy,
Right.
that there's a real kind of rocket industry. There's there's a computer industry. There's a science. There's a technology of making cell phones and so forth. This to me is not all culture, because I can take all of these things and I can separate them out, and I don't have to name these by what they remind me of in culture. I can consider these things, in a sense, a kind of like cultural beings, or culture entities. I can think of them as entities in the world.
Yeah.
So that's all. I discriminate a lot in culture.
Okay.
And I discriminate between the people part of culture and the institutional parts of culture.
Yeah. And so, it is coming down to semantics. So my interpretation of culture is probably a better fit, but yes. Speaking of which, I think where I first came across the term of culture being used in this, and if I'm not mistaken, it was Matt from the lectures. And I thought, when I use the term culture, suddenly the connections to what Heidegger is saying and where the boundaries are, because I always want Heidegger, I always seem to make him like this person who can really extend way beyond things, and he's going to answer all the big questions, and and no,
he answers fundamental questions about being. That's all. That's all he does.
Yeah.
But he does it very well, and he does it extremely extensively. He never stops working. It's like he's trying to reproduce Aristotle or something. He's going from one thing and then defining one thing, going forward, defining something else. Creating something else, summarizing what he's trying to accomplish in the next in his next bit of writing. Always trying to push forward through this problem that he set out for himself of defining being in the world.
Yeah, and
the meaning, not being in the world, but the meaning of being in the world. So that's the challenge he's setting for himself, and in my opinion, he's being very fruitful. You know what I mean? Compared to other philosophers, he's a fruitful philosopher.
Well,
He's
I
he's
mean,
a philosopher where you read one little bit and you say, wow, that's great. And then you read another little bit after it and you say, wow, that's great. And then sometimes there's like a, oh, wow, I didn't understand that, right? You know, but then you can go back and say, well, maybe I didn't think it was great, but maybe I can figure out what he meant anyway. And you know, and you can sort of like go on.
yeah, I think he tackles the idea as a phenomenologist, where he's trying to describe the simplest of things that we take for granted. So he is walking the talk in that way. And yeah, I did not make it more than that. And again, he also says we can only go to the edges and we can't, you know, somehow extend beyond our world. And so that's probably the biggest thing I've taken from Heidegger and appreciate. I do see gaps though in terms of bias there, because sometimes he's speaking about a world that I think other people might come into and saying that's actually not a close representation. So I think there is some bias there, as there would be with everyone.
Where does he define the world?
So, I mean, again,
I can answer that. He's talking about the world is things ready to hand, things present at hand.
Yep.
You know, and being.
Relevant presence, yeah.
Yeah. So he is dividing the world into beings and things, and he's defining relevance and reference, which a lot of philosophers have done before him. So he has his own relevance, which is based on ontology and the ontological analysis, and what he calls the priority of primordiality, which is, you know, which is something you can like accept or kind of throw it away or kind of like follow. It's like when I said, well, like I say, if you want to do a careful philosophical interpretation of Heidegger, there's an awful lot there in terms of his methodology being continually complex and very open. And he's also an expert on methodology, just like Kant was an expert on what's the word? Metaphysics. Kant was like an expert on the metaphysics of the 18th century. Heidegger is an expert on methodology in the 20th century. So almost to the same stature, which is incredible for him to accomplish, you know, that same stature as Kant, who was a really wonderful philosopher with crazy ideas in the 18th century, but in my opinion, sorry.
Warren, you're going to
anyway, sorry?
There's the side, you know, there's always the side chat going on, and it goes by so fast.
It goes so fast. Yeah, well, we can save it. I found out if you you can either copy and paste, or you can click the ... and do the save chat, and at the end of the meeting, and it'll be there tomorrow. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. So
Sure.
Warren, you were touching on something, and it's already scrolled by, and I think Lucas was also with you there.
So
Go ahead.
I started studying this with Dr. Fernando Flores, who worked and helped Werner Erhard understand Heidegger. Flores did his PhD, double PhD with computer science and philosophy under Dreyfus. And I did a 3-year ontological design program with Dr. Flores. And one of the things that when I looked at that as a 25-year-old, I figured, okay, we're going to reinvent the world. Great. Well, looking at it as a 61-year-old, I see that life's finite, and you need to pick your battles, right? You can do ontological reconstruction, but not all of it. So
yeah, I think Werner Erhard had a good subset. What I was exposed to was like he had a good fix on interpretation, probably from your associate, and the is. So he concentrated on, you know, just a few select items. And also death. There was death, and like mind experiments. You would have to imagine that everyone in the world is mad at you. You know, that you're at or something. Oh, everyone. First, you'd like imagine that everyone in the world thinks you're the most important person in the world, and you'd have to kind of visualize that with your eyes closed or whatever. And then you'd have to visualize everyone in the world is angry at you and is mad at you, and what's going to happen now, and so forth. So there were very nice mind experiments and things like that, and everybody, because he keeps everyone up extra hours, like you'd have to stay up for like 13 hours usually, at least, or at least 13 hours. So because the sessions were so long, you'd kind of like wake up exhausted the next morning, and sleep deprivation was part of his methodology, not just teaching a quick version of Heidegger from Dr. Flores. I'd like to. Does he have a book, by the way, Dr. Flores?
Quite a few.
Oh, great.
Right. So he's written like 6 books. Understanding Computers and Cognition was a big one with Terry
nice.
Winograd, professor at Stanford. He was Sergey Brin's doctoral advisor.
Right.
So, and he also wrote a book on disclosing new worlds, on democracy, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and about love with Dr. Solomon here at the University of Texas, and trust.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to try to read some of his books. That's wonderful.
So his motivation to get into this was that he was Minister of Finance and Economics in Chile, and he was removed from office at gunpoint and put into political prison for 3 years.
Oh my gosh!
Where he could sit and think with the other intelligentsia of the country and figure out what happened. We thought we knew what we were doing, and now it didn't go well. So then he committed his life to figuring out, well, how do we live together more effectively than this mess?
Right, but Chile is interesting because it's a lot the way the United States is now. In Chile, there were both radicals, Marxists, liberals, who were just trying to have a better society through good government, and a lot of Catholics, and people who thought that fascism was right. In other words, the right wing very much, a very large component of the right wing there, thinks that fascism is the way to go, and that was that's kind of led to the Pinochet revolution, which was actually done over the head of a Marxist. So you had an elected Marxist who was deposed from power by a fascist, and it's like the attitude of Pinochet, of the government, the new government, their attitude and the attitude of the right wing was all's fair in love and war. In other words, like you had this coming to you, for being elected.
Hey.
There you go. There's another one right there from Australia.
And in later years, he returned. He was a senator, and he was in the running for presidency. But he said, we need to get past this. And
sure.
No, they weren't willing to do that. They wanted to maintain the integrity between the two.
So he left the country.
You got to get past this.
So he left the country like Salvador Allende.
No, he's still there. He just didn't go for the presidency.
Oh, okay. He's still there. Oh, okay.
Yes.
So have you spent a lot of time in, I don't want to waste everyone's time, but did you spend a lot of time in Chile?
I didn't. I studied with him and worked in his company for 3 years in Berkeley. Okay. And there's a paper he wrote for Chile, the vision for Chile, which is quite brilliant. It's a long paper, and it's an opening of possibilities for his country. It's beautiful and inspirational. As an example of what leadership can be.
Exactly. And so that's kind of a potentiality of this kind of analysis, isn't it? In other words, Absolutely. That shows some of the potentiality of this kind of painstakingly forward-looking analysis that leads to new conceptions of entities in the world. In Dr. Flores's case, I guess, the possibilities for society and government.
Exactly.
And that's something that, you know, like I find myself debating that a lot. I find people, they want to debate society and government in the United States, you know. And most of them are constitutionalists, which is cool because that's the government, as it is. So that's based on the Constitution. So talking with them can be fruitful because I don't think it's just because I'll agree with them sometimes, but I think it's because when you actually look at the way things are constituted in the world, you get good results in your analysis. Sometimes it can be depressing. That's the only kind of drawback. I'm kind of letting.
I think the trick is to articulate a future, articulate a space of possibilities that resonates with people, that they're willing to join in and say, yeah, that's the future I'd like. So let's do that.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it's not me. I got lower expectations for myself.
Me too.
Let's see where I go. Yeah, I definitely want to write something, and it might be about Heidegger, but I'm kind of like I'm just sort of like in the middle of not being a non-writer and being a writer. In other words, I used to be a writer. I was a software engineer, but I was working towards being a writer, and I suddenly like bailed out at the sort of after making a lot of progress and doing a lot of work towards writing a novel. I just bailed out on it and did other things like philosophy, and then but I'm looking forward to actually writing philosophy, writing in the future. So. And not just writing journals, you know, I have philosophy journals, but actually writing a coherent body of work. What do you do, Warren?
Software.
Software
so,
too? Yeah.
And data. So it turns out ontology is central focus in enterprise data as well.
It's really big these days. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So everything comes full circle.
Will is a programmer,
right? Do you mind, since we're going down this pathway anyways, how does ontology, I'm unfamiliar with some computer programming world, but how does ontology play a role in that particular form of data you spoke of?
Well, we need to know what the data means, right? It's like you've got unimaginable amounts of data. What does it mean? And so you can actually write formal ontologies. There's a language for doing that, and it's based on the people that invented the World Wide Web. So they're pretty rigorous. They know what they're doing. So you can say anything rigorously, and you can do it with formal logic. So you can reason over it. You can ask questions. And for the most part, the computer science world is clueless about it because it's too different. Because there's the equipmental network of understanding primarily around SQL and those traditional approaches, and this is new. And innovation's hard, particularly when you have that established network of equipmental and people and so on.
So does I take it you're talking about the ontological web? Does doing the work in the ontological web give you an opening to algorithms? Does it create algorithms for you, or just produce more information about the data?
So the web can become the database. The internet becomes the database, and if you look at like Wikipedia, it's exposed as a database you can ask questions about, and it's tied into everything else, and it's unimaginably big. It's the linked open data world, and it's all based upon defining what things are and how are they related, and there's a formal language for doing that.
Right. So it's about finding information, not creating algorithms. That was kind of my question, because I used to be a programmer. That was my big thing, was here I go, and
I'm curious.
that yeah, and that the but the I was asking, just to do because you can actually create structures in programming languages that cause code to fall out. And so I was wondering if that was the goal of the ontological web, but it sounds like it's not there yet.
It's about connecting data. And if you think about particularly life sciences, they can connect like clinical trials and the vast data of genomics, and they can come into understandings and insights that were not possible otherwise and can really benefit people.
But you might be looking at language ties, like particular words that might be significant. You might be looking at patterns of behavior. You might be looking at particular populations and if there's similarities. Are you speaking like things like that?
It's actually foundational for natural language processing, because if you want to understand free text, you need to extract what are the things that they're talking about. And so that's ontology. It's like, well, what are the things and how are they related? And how do I make sense of this stream of language? And
Heidegger talks about analytical philology, which was a thing in those days. Instead of being a physicist, you would go to university to become a philologist or an analytical philologist, and that was probably the beginnings of that was the beginnings of this concentration on ontology, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and language is
so
tricky. Oh, yeah. Language is tricky, as we just found today, because I'm using culture, and you had a good point for culture, and then you sort of defined your meaning of culture more extensively, which yes,
more limitations, more distinctions.
Yeah, exactly.
And it shows up in terms of intelligibility. So Flores and Winograd and the Dreyfus brothers were all skeptics about AI, and it's based upon Heidegger, because Heidegger would say that you can never make explicit the background of understanding, that aspect of design, and yet that's what the strong AI people were trying to do, is make all this stuff explicit, put it into the computer, and their claim is you can't. Now, it's gotten better to the point where they can kind of simulate it, but it's at a fundamental philosophical level, they may never actually be able to do it.
I see. Yeah, I usually argue that point. I haven't read the books though. I was actually Sunday, I think it was yesterday, I was talking to some Seattle Analytical Philosophy Society, and that's not this group, right, David?
Well, they're all connected. They
are connected, okay. So anyway, I was talking to those guys, and there was one of them that was an AI guy, and so I did not challenge him on AI, on any of his talk about AI, and he said the possibility of general AI, general artificial intelligence. So in other words, he was careful. He had been through some of these books. He understood that there were people opposed to the concept, and that it was only a possibility. But he was gung ho. You could tell, he was beneath that. He's gung ho, and that's what he cares about. That possibility, and then so I didn't challenge him on that at all. I just but when he mentioned that was it Elon Musk, because of his intelligence and because of his accomplishments and because he wants to do this, we're probably going to succeed. And what I said was, every epoch has its crackpot. He didn't take very kindly to that, but it was a great argument.
Yeah, I think the answer's in Heidegger.
Yeah. He's been trying to get this car. He's been trying to get the car autonomous fully autonomous for a long time, and he can't do it. He can't find enough programmers in enough rooms, you know, in the right network to accomplish general drivability yet for his cars. So how does anyone think he's going to accomplish general intelligence in machines?
Wait a second. These cars are not fully having the capacity to be self-automated, and yet they're out on the streets. Aren't they on the streets?
Yeah, you can drive them on highways.
Oh, okay.
You can drive them up to a stoplight. But if the car beeps, you got to grab the wheel. You can't sleep during the beeps because the car can crash into a truck if it's the wrong color.
All right. Out of my area of expertise and actually interest at this point, so I didn't know where that was at, you know. But you hear a lot of people talking about it. Just the other day, some gentleman was taking kids on a ride or something like that. So I'm thinking, really, kids? If it's not 100%, but anyway, okay.
Yeah, they've been doing it for a long time. They've been promising it for a very long period of time, years. But
I'm
they
optimistic.
still haven't accomplished
It's just the idea of general AI has a Heideggerian problem at the bottom of it, and
Sure.
I don't know how it resolves.
Well, I mean, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Is it
expert?
possible for an AI to rewrite its initial rule set? Because it seems like anything it does has to like carry out its initial rule set, and it's against that rule set that it is able to appropriate like the things that you train it on.
We're way beyond rule based. That was a long time ago. So the machine learning actually does, the algorithms essentially do write themselves, and they're unexplainable. So that's really where we are. That's how they've gotten this close to self-driving cars. It's really rather good. And Alexa and Siri get pretty close to being able to have an intelligible conversation, and then they make really stupid comments because they don't understand the context of what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's probably some people that haven't put two and two together that are, you know, running some of those projects. You say Alexa's
Well, no,
particularly bad?
It's just hard.
Yeah.
It's like people can disambiguate contextual problems and make sense of each other really effectively, and we make mistakes all the time, and it's the basis of a lot of comedy. But computers are getting better, but they're just so easy to trick up still.
Oh, I don't like Siri at all. I mean, I'm trying to use Siri. I know that if you know the right verbs, it works great. You know, if you just say things like, give me a reminder for 6 a.m., you know, to visit my mother, you know, and stuff like that, it works, right? But if you don't get the language exactly right, it can give you it can return something very useless, you know. It might even misunderstand you. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by like your discussion of like self-writing like programs or AIs or like machine learning. Because it seems like what would they have to do there? Would they have to like create like something like a function? Like
So one of the approaches is gradient descent. It looks for optimizations. So you look at a problem, a multivariate problem, and figure out which of those variants are actually significant. And then essentially it tries different values and it sees, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And it keeps heading towards optimizations. And that's pretty effective. And you can hit Nash equilibriums, which are like local maximizations that aren't really the right answer. And you also keep a training set so that you don't overtrain it. So you say, well, get as good as possible on this training set, but then let me check against the reserved part to see if I didn't just write a rule that matches exactly the data. So is it actually something that's useful?
Right.
And then there's Bayesian models, which is probably the most promising thing right now. And it's machine learning.
Right.
You let the data figure it out.
Do you think like that initial problem? So it's like it's given this kind of task. The task is almost like its fundamental assumption, or like when I think rule set, I just think like it's given a task, and like this kind of like these parameters through which it like deals with what you give it, and it seems to be able to like alter what it's doing based upon what you're giving it, but nonetheless it still has that like initial input, like that's set up.
Well, you have to give it a goal, right? What's it trying to accomplish? Is it trying to classify things? It's like therapies that cure cancer and therapies that don't, or you know, what's the best mixture of chemicals?
Yeah, there's known algorithms for classification that work pretty good. What happens is that even if they don't work perfectly, you come to successive iterations of approximation. So you could run the same algorithm against the same data set, 5 or 10 times, and then you can do a scoring. You can score the results of each time you ran the algorithm against that data set, and come up with a particular run that created the clearest distinctions in classification. And that, not that those distinctions would necessarily be correct, but you can have controls. In other words, it has to be checked by a human, or a control could be that all the colors have to match up in any class or something like that. I was going to try to answer your question more directly, Julian. Yes, you can write code that produces code. So
Okay.
you can actually create second generation, third generation, and fourth generation algorithms.
Thank you guys for the explanations.
Yeah. So anyway, is everybody, is enough people tired of Heidegger now? I said I can go over my the last notes to see if there's anything I can't leave out. He's a bit of a poet. Since this is the last meeting on Heidegger, I'll just give some of my opinions. He's quite the poet. He says, being towards the end, oh, not that. Oh, here's a good one on the they. The they is blocking choices and making sure that, this is the quote, Dasein gets carried along by the nobody, and thus ensnares itself in inauthenticity. So Dasein gets carried along by the nobody, which is the culture. So that's where I'd say Heidegger places the notion of culture. In other words, if there's a beingless being in the world, then that would be perhaps what he calls the nobody, the manufactured being of the they. And then, so a lot about disclosedness, which we talked about, the clearing for anxiety. Reticence is a mode of discourse. Now, this is something that doesn't necessarily ring well with me, but it's probably true. Reticence is a mode of discourse in which the discourse of the conscience never comes to utterance. And the call to have a conscience comes from uncanniness or insensibility, nonsense, or from nonsense, projecting oneself against one's own most being guilty, ready for anxiety, and ready and resolute. So this is really important in this section of the analysis. Is that the resoluteness has to arise, ready and being ready for anxiety out of his being is not yet becoming a being towards death. That's where the resoluteness falls out. So once you get used to analyzing what you're reading here, which admittedly is very complex, you sort of realize his methodology is this: things fall out. He does an analysis. He creates a bunch of objects, and then something falls out of it. In this case, it's resoluteness, and it's a habit, and it's a type of habit, and it's a projection of oneself upon your own being guilty, and making yourself anxious. So we talked about that already. So we'll leave it there. But this being able to project yourself in time. A lot of this analysis is projection in time, which is very meaningful to me. I don't think that should be understated. You know, that Heidegger, being in time, is about time. Or being in time. Could have been called being in time. As a matter of fact, Sartre calls this book Being in Nothingness, right? Yeah. So that's picking up from Heidegger. And then the nothingness is basically following the they blindly. David, you want to take it out?
I think we're at a natural ending point. Yeah, I mean, 3 hours. That's enough. But yeah, I'm actually this next upcoming Nietzsche segment is really, really good. So I'm
great.
For that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to try to stick it out. I hate reading, but you know, nothing else, not much else to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this will be a lot of fun, and then yeah, we'll just keep going as long as there's interest. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, David.
Okay, everyone, and meet back here next week.
Yeah, thanks for your comments, Warren.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it was really great.
I'll probably get it up tomorrow, for next Monday on the calendar.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone.